Nearly 57 years ago, at the invitation of Dr. Timuel Black, a 27-year-old Dr. King delivered his first major address in the city of Chicago, right here in Rockefeller Chapel. In that address, he talked about the conflict between the forces of light and dark. He talked about the importance of democracy, justice, and love. And he challenged everyone to not slow up in the pursuit of justice because we have a date with destiny. The fact that Dr. King chose the University of Chicago as the setting for his first major address in the city is certainly an honor for this institution, but also informative. First, it demonstrates that Dr. King had a special affinity for students and a strong belief in the power of young leaders to be agents of change to make the world a more just and civil place. Second, it reinforces his belief that institutions like the University of Chicago had a responsibility and a role to play in having a positive impact on society. Today, 57 years later, we again gather at Rockefeller Chapel, this time to celebrate the life and work of Dr. King. And the challenge to us today is to ensure that the good reasons for Dr. King choosing the University of Chicago as his initial platform still hold true. And I believe they do. Indeed, in my position as Vice President for Civic Engagement, I have the privilege of witnessing the energy and ambition that our students have for making a difference in this world, which is reflective of the life that Dr. King lived and the hopes that he dreamed. I also have the privilege of working for a president who firmly believes that an urban research university cannot be great unless it is civically engaged with the world around it. That civic engagement must be part of the university's DNA. Tonight, we are in store for an evening of thoughtful celebration of Dr. King's legacy. In addition to hearing from University of Chicago President Zimmer, we will have a reading from Dr. King's work by PhD student Rachel Watson. We will have music and dance. And the centerpiece of tonight's celebration will be a conversation between Professor Charles Payne and legendary filmmaker and civil rights activist Judy Richardson. Let me close with a final thought from Dr. King. If I had to identify a principle espoused by Dr. King that I think most underlies the urgency of being civically engaged, it is the idea of shared destiny. As Dr. King so eloquently put it, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one destiny affects all indirectly. May we all continue to listen to the lessons that Dr. King has shared with us and find ways to apply them to the work we do and the lives we live. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the 13th President of the University of Chicago, Robert J. Zimmer.
Thank you very much, Derek, and thanks to all of you for coming here this evening. And let me add my welcome to that of Derek to the University of Chicago celebration of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now, in 1956, when Dr. King visited the University of Chicago, he spoke before 1,600 people, and they had gathered for the Thomas Jefferson Day rally. He implored his audience at that point to continue the fight for social justice. And what he said then was, and very famously, if you can't fly, you must run. If you cannot run, you must walk. If you cannot walk, you must crawl. But the most important thing to remember is that you must keep moving. These words still serve as a call to action today as we remember and celebrate the legacy and the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Dr. King occupies a complex and very multifaceted position within our collective memory. He was an activist, orator, poet, politician, and peacemaker, and more. That complexity reflects how extraordinary an individual he was. We remember him today for that complexity, but very importantly, we remember him because of the pivotal role he played in the life of this nation. He articulated a spirit of determination, engagement, and inclusion that continues to inspire people across the nation to strive for social equality and justice for all. And it is important on this day that we focus on the importance of inclusion for the central mission of the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago is and needs to be and needs to remain always tenacious in our shared pursuit of understanding and deeply engaged in the mission of discovery. And this collective engagement demands an open and rigorous culture of inquiry, which depends on the presence of faculty, presence of students, the presence of staff with vastly different and often competing perspectives. Such distinctive viewpoints encourage the vigorous exchange of ideas, out of which may grow more comprehensive and innovative approaches to some of the world's most pressing problems. And in this way, we are constantly saying and believing that diversity is central to creating a rich educational experience and is one of the bedrocks upon which the most far-reaching results depend. Now, this afternoon, just really an hour or so ago, I had the privilege of conferring this year's Diversity Leadership Awards, which recognize the university's alumni and the university's staff, whose work embodies Dr. King's values and his commitment to equality for all. And I'd like to just acknowledge the award winners right now. The 2013 Diversity Leadership Alumni Award is Michael Bennett, who is a community organizer and associate professor of sociology at DePaul. Michael received both his master's and doctoral degrees from the School of Social Services Administration here at the university. He's had a long career in higher education and has been deeply involved in local, national, and international economic development projects. The recipient of the 2013 Diversity Leadership Staff Award is Kim Ransom, who's the founding director of the University of Chicago Collegiate Scholars Program. Kim has dedicated herself to Chicago youth, giving them the comprehensive support that they need to succeed in high school, in college, and beyond. And I just asked Michael and Kim if they would stand and just be recognized by everyone. Thank you and congratulations again. I'd also like to welcome Professor Charles Payne and our special guest this evening, Judy Richardson, who will be introduced more fully in just a moment. As a civil rights activist and filmmaker, Ms. Richardson occupies an important position from which she has represented Dr. King's role in history. By way of conclusion, let me turn again to Dr. King. As a student at Morehouse College, he wrote some very important words about education, which I think resonate very much with the University of Chicago. So he wrote, "Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from fiction. But we must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the true goal of education." So as we come together today to celebrate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., this is an educational goal toward which we can all work. So thank you, and again, welcome this evening.
Good evening. My name is Rachel Watson. I am a PhD student at the Divinity School here at UChicago, and it is my extreme honor to not only speak from this podium, but to share the mic with such illustrious personages as we have here tonight, and to have the added honor of reading the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm going to be reading an excerpt from the letter from a Birmingham jail, written, as its title suggests, by Martin Luther King Jr. in quote, peace and brotherhood in the Birmingham City Jail on April 16, 1963, and addressed to my dear fellow clergymen. The following is a very brief excerpt from the masterly epistle, so familiar to us. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait almost always means never. We must come to see, with one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Fun Town is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you may be, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. When you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what is happening and what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that it can be gained. Consciously or unconsciously, he has been caught up by the zeitgeist, and with his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, the United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. If one recognizes this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand why public demonstrations are taking place. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations, and he must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Let him go on freedom rides and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of nonviolent, direct action. And now, this approach is being termed extremist. Well, though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from that label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists.
Good evening. It's an honor to be a guest here at the university, the Lab School Jazz Ensemble. We thought how to best commemorate the music and the message. Both revolutionaries, Dr. Martin Luther King and the composer John Coltrane. Shortly after the September 15th bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963, John Coltrane composed Alabama in response to the 4 girls who were senselessly murdered in that act of terrorism. In '64, as an opening address to the Berlin Jazz Festival, Dr. King wrote an address talking about the importance of jazz. And so it is our pleasure to bring together both minds, both inspirational and musical, in our offering for you today. We hope you enjoy our presentation of John Coltrane's Alabama. God has wrought many things out of oppression. He has endowed his creatures with the capacity to create. And from this capacity has flowed the sweet songs of sorrow and joy that have allowed man to cope with his environment and many different situations. Jazz speaks for life. The blues tell the story of life's difficulties. And if you think for a moment, you will realize that they take the hardest realities of life and put them into music, only to come out with some new hope or sense of triumph. This is triumphant music. Modern jazz has continued its tradition, singing the songs of a more complicated urban existence. When life itself offers no order and meaning, the musician creates an order and meaning from the sounds of the earth which flow through his instrument. It is no wonder that so much of the search for identity among American Negroes was championed by jazz musicians. Long before the modern essayists and scholars wrote of racial identity as a problem for a multiracial world, musicians were returning to their roots to affirm that which was stirring in their souls. Much of the power of our freedom movement in the United States has come from this music. It has strengthened us with its sweet rhythms when courage began to fail. It has calmed us with its rich harmonies when spirits were down. And now, jazz is exported to the world. For in the particular struggle of the Negro in America, there is something akin to the universal struggle of modern man. Everybody has the blues. Everybody longs for meaning. Everybody needs to love and be loved. Everybody needs to clap hands and be happy. Everybody longs for faith. In music, especially this broad category called jazz, there is a stepping stone toward all of these.
Please, let's give another round of applause for the Laboratory School Jazz Ensemble. A big part of the movement was making sure to encourage our young folk. We have to remember that. My name is Adam Green. I'm a professor of history here at the University of Chicago and also master of the Social Science Collegiate Division, and I've been asked to introduce our speakers for today. As both of our featured speakers tonight are known for saying, when it comes to the civil rights movement, we celebrate its oratory more readily than we do its organizing. The attractions of the visionary speech or sermon, of course, are why we identify civil rights for African Americans most intuitively as King's Dream. This aligns with templates of political, historical, and ecclesiastical thinking that hold the transcendent agent, the One, up above those presumed to be the beneficiaries of that leader's capacity, dedication, and all too often sacrifice. The fundamental flaw in this conception is that social movement is viewed as outcome rather than as process. To what degrees laws did or did not change, to what extent power was or was not more justly distributed, in what ways equality was or was not achieved, are matters derivative of a more elemental investigation. Did the people transform their view of the world, enlarge appreciation of their capacity, and thereby change their relations with others? Such discovery requires attention to the many, not the few or the one. And such accomplishments are best found in everyday activities rather than extraordinary events. Considering the civil rights movement along these lines not only fleshes out our understandings of this singular episode of social change, it reminds us that transformative action is the prerogative of ordinary people rather than extraordinary ones, so long as they apply and dedicate themselves to the demands and the potential of each day, every day. We are fortunate this evening to take part in a program that not only extends this understanding of the civil rights movement, but also exemplifies its spirit of beloved community in the form of respectful, rigorous, and loving conversation. So many of the lasting gains of the movement, ones that transformed, enlarged, and changed lives, happened in precisely this manner. Let me introduce both of our speakers. Dr. Judy Richardson is a filmmaker, educator, and from 1963 to 1966, a regular staff member of the National Office for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. In that last capacity, Dr. Richardson played a vital role in several of the movement's most powerful chapters, helping run the organization's office in Atlanta during its early years, relocating with the national office to Greenwood, Mississippi in 1964 at the time of Freedom Summer, helping launch the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Lowndes County, Alabama in spring 1965. Following her work with SNCC, Dr. Richardson moved to Washington, D.C., where she helped found Drum and Spear Bookstore, the largest black bookstore at the time. Beginning in 1978, she started to work with Henry Hampton and others on the landmark documentary series on the movement, Eyes on the Prize. She served as education director for that series, associate professor for Eyes on the Prize 2, co-producer for Malcolm X, Make It Plain, and director and producer of numerous films and video installations afterward, including most recently the award-winning Scarred Justice, recounting the story of the Orangeburg, South Carolina massacre of 1968. In 2010, she co-edited Hands on the Freedom Plow, Personal Accounts of Women in SNCC, the most comprehensive account of women's contributions to and experience within SNCC, published by the University of Illinois Press. She is currently a visiting professor at Brown University. We are deeply honored to welcome her here this evening. Charles Payne is the Frank P. Dixon Distinguished Professor in the School of Social Service Administration, as well as affiliate in the Urban Education Institute at the University of Chicago. He is a leading researcher in education reform, enhancement, and equity, who has written 3 books and numerous articles on that topic. Recently, he served as Chief Education Officer for Chicago Public Schools. He also holds a place as one of the most incisive scholars of the civil rights movement and related traditions of social change, having written 3 additional books on that topic. I've Got the Light of Freedom, The Organizing Tradition and the Mississippi Freedom Struggle from the University of California Press is the best known of these. A multiple prize-winning work, I've Got the Light of Freedom recounts the extraordinary course of the freedom struggles in Greenwood, Mississippi in the early 1960s. I imagine that the compliment that matters the most to Charles is the regard that movement veterans have for his keen grasp of their aspirations as well as their achievements 2 generations ago. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Judy Richardson and Charles Payne.
You got your mic on?
No, I don't. He's reminding me to put my mic on.
I worked with her before.
Yes.
First, I want to thank Adam for that very analytical, the most analytical introduction I have ever had, and a very generous introduction from a very knowledgeable person about the civil rights movement. I want to thank all of you for being here and for sharing this evening, and I am absolutely certain you're going to both enjoy and learn from it. One of the most enriching experiences of my life has been the opportunities I have had to meet people from that era of the movement. And of all of the folk that I've met, this is one of my absolute favorites to talk to, and you will know why in 20 minutes. So, do you want to start by introducing?
Yes. I'd just like to introduce 3 of my SNCC sisters who are in the audience. I want them to stand up. First, we've got Mildred Foreman Page, we've got Lauren Kress, and we've got Fanny Rushing. So you all got to stand up right over here. Yo! And all of them were absolutely integral to SNCC's functioning. Lauren was weren't you in Natchez, Mississippi? Lauren? You were in Natchez? Yeah, she was in a really bad place in Mississippi, let me just say that. And Mildred, of course, was all over the place, and we will hear in a minute how she was not really nonviolent. And and then, of course, Fanny held up the Chicago SNCC office, which was really important in terms of the whole national community SNCC offices around the country. So,
but you know, even that, she told me she wanted to introduce her colleagues before we did anything else. But even that says something about what was different about SNCC as an organization and as a culture. The principle that what is important is not the individual but the group,
Yes.
right? And that the group should be acknowledged over the individual. That said, maybe you should say a little bit about SNCC, what it was, and how you see its role in the movement.
Okay. SNCC, first of all, SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That's SNCC. And SNCC was the organization that grows out of the 1960 sit-ins, which start in, well, there were earlier, but the one that we most know about is Greensboro, February 1st, 1960. And after those happened, you get all of these student movements coming primarily off the black campuses in the South. So Julian Bond, who has this illustrious career, of course, and becomes most recently chair of the NAACP, he's coming out of the Atlanta movement. He's at Morehouse. You have Diane Nash, whom you all know from Chicago. She's one of the main leaders of the Nashville student movement, coming off of Fisk campus. You got John Lewis, who of course is longtime a congressman from Georgia, U.S. congressman, and he's coming from the American Baptist Seminary, also in Nashville. So you have all of these student leaders, already leaders, who are called together in April of 1960, and they're called together by this amazing organizer that most people don't know the name of, and her name is Ella Baker. Miss Baker is considered, to say godmother is a little too maternal. Miss Baker's organizing philosophy is one of the things that grounds SNCC in terms of a bottom-up grassroots organizing style. And so Miss Baker calls these folks together, and on April 15th, 1960, they are coming from all over these black campuses. And her idea is they need to get together so that they can talk about common concerns and some of the things that they can help one another with. They are already leaders in their own right. She also says to them, first, it's got to be about more than just a hamburger. It's not about just sitting down at a sit-in. You got to be able to afford the hamburger. And so we talk a lot about economic justice issues as 15, 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds in SNCC. The other thing she says is, because she knows all of these movements, she was a field secretary for director of branches for the NAACP. So she gives a lot of her contacts to SNCC. But she says to the young people, and at the time she is also temporary executive secretary of Dr. King's organization, SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And she says to all of these young leaders, you know, these folks are going to try and kind of bring you in as youth chapters. NAA wants you as a youth chapter. Dr. King's organization wants you as a youth chapter. You all need to stay independent. You need to keep your own independence and your own energy and your own decision making. And in fact, SNCC, as a result, was the only youth-led, it was also black-led, but primarily youth-led of the national civil rights organizations. And we go into the rural South and we start organizing around the right to vote and building on a lot of the organization that had already been done by some of those folks who were furrowing the ground, like Amzie Moore and the folks that Charles talks about, before any national organization gets in there. So we are building on other previous organizing capabilities of black folks in the South. And can I just say something? This is an amazing man. I'm just going to say this real quick. This man was the first one that SNCC people certainly, and movement people generally said, oh my God, there's a scholar who gets it? This man, when he came out with I've Got the Light of Freedom, the organizing tradition in Mississippi, I go to him as the resource. Because I can open his book and find 1950, who knew that there were black folks who were organizing a meeting of 15,000 black people in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. 5 years before Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott, okay? He talks about this, and he talks about it with an understanding that you're not just sitting there as a participant thinking, oh gosh, I wish he hadn't written this. Everything he writes is wonderful. So, there you go.
We're supposed to, that was very kind. We're supposed to be talking about what you wrote.
Well.
So, to what she said about SNCC, I think that the shorthand phrase that most scholars use is that it's the militant wing of the movement. It's the movement's left wing. It's pushy, it's edgy, right? And it's clearly taking the older, more established, adult-run organizations and pushing them way beyond their comfort zone. It is not just that SNCC goes into the rural areas. SNCC goes into the rural areas against everybody's advice, right? against the advice of the entire civil rights establishment. You do not go into rural Alabama and rural Mississippi. They're young people. They're hard-headed, and they did it. All right? And then the rest of the movement had to follow them. All right? The other thing that I would just want to stress, even though you said it, is that a part of the way I think of it, Ella Baker breathes into SNCC is this profound faith in the capacity of ordinary people to lead, right? That your leaders do not have to come from above, right? They can come from maids and laborers and sharecroppers, right? That's a different way to think about it. Okay. I want to say first that the book that she co-edited, I think, is easily the most important civil rights scholarship of the last decade, easily that. And I want to ask you, if you would, Judy, to go to the essay that you wrote yourself and talk about your initial encounter with SNCC.
Okay.
If you would read part of it.
What I'm going to, I hope I have it here. Can I just, by the way, before I do my piece, can I just mention the intro to this book, first of all, just to know, this book took us 15 years to write, okay, because it's 52 women, including, for example, Mildred Foreman Page. And it took us 15 years because, first of all, there's 6 editors, 3 African American, 3 white, all women, all SNCC women. And we had different views of what this book was going to be like, and we were strong SNCC women. So we, you know, there were points where I thought, okay, are we really going to get through with this book? But it took 15 years also to get all of these 52 women's stories in, and then to find a publisher. So it becomes University of Illinois Press's book, and it becomes their top seller in 2010, and one of their top sellers of all time. But the reason is because it's these women's stories. It's not through anyone else's filter. And what's wonderful about it is that it focuses on the women. And the book starts with an intro that says, "The book you are holding in your hands will open the door to a special world." It is a book by women who, now mostly in our 60s and 70s, and by the way, that used to read 50s and 60s, but it kept going, are teachers and organizers and doctors and singers and farmers. She goes on, but in the 1960s, some of us leaped over the expectations of our families and communities, while others acted out of family and community traditions of social justice, all to become organizers and agitators in the civil rights movement. Now, it also says when you open this book, you will enter a different world where danger is ever present, beatings, shootings, bombings, and church burnings happen all too frequently. The issue of the day is always how to make social and political change, how to press forward, how to keep going, in short, how to make a movement. In this world, freedom and justice are real, solid, and tangible. Freedom and justice are the reasons for being and doing and the reasons for dying. Though the voices are different, they all tell the same story of women bursting out of constraints, leaving school, leaving their hometowns, meeting new people, talking into the night, laughing, going to jail, being afraid, teaching in freedom schools, working in the field in the rural areas, dancing at the Elks Hall, because we had to have fun. We were 17, 18 years old, working the Watts line to relay horror story after horror story, telling the press, telling the story, telling the word, and making a difference in this world. And all of these were regular people. They were not exceptional in the least. And that's whose stories you get here.
Can I interrupt to say one thing? Notice that I have asked her 2 questions. She has not answered either of them.
It's true.
No, but that's one of the most important things I learned interviewing SNCC people. You can't really interview them in the sense that you ask a question and they ask a question that, you know, they always answer their own question. I think that's important.
It's true.
Go ahead now and answer my question.
Yes, now I'll answer your question. Okay.
You're supposed to be
oh,
reading
that's what I'm
from
supposed to be reading from my piece. Okay. All right. So, first of all, I get to SNCC through, I grew up in Tarrytown, New York, which is right outside New York City. And my father, we all lived under the hill, all the black folks, as well as some poor white people. And my father worked in the plant, the Fisher Body plant, Chevrolet, and he had helped organize the United Auto Workers local there. And so he dies on the line, on the assembly line, when I'm 7. And my mother becomes a single parent, gets my sister to Bennington College, to me, to Swarthmore College. When I get there, I I find that there is an SDS chapter on campus, and the SDS was the Students for a Democratic Society, which was the progressive, primarily northern white student group that was doing amazing work around social justice in the north, but was also supporting what the black college campuses and the sit-ins were doing in the south, and what SNCC was doing in the south. So I come in, and I find that the SDS chapter on Swarthmore's campus has organized busloads of students to go to work with Cambridge, Maryland. Oh, we're up there. Can we still do a photo, tech person? Do you know whether we can still do that? Okay. If we can, oh, look at that, it's amazing. Sorry. There is the number that I'm looking for is Gloria Richardson, and she is Gloria Richardson, number 8. If we can put a photo of her. Because what happens is, first of all, I go on the bus, not because of any great commitment, it's because my mother is not there to stop me, and it's my first year away from home. And when I get there, though, what I find is Gloria Richardson. And Gloria is that one in the middle. Gloria, by the way, was not nonviolent. And Gloria gets pulled into the movement by her daughter, Donna, because the youth movement happened first in Cambridge, Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland. You will see behind her Stokely Carmichael, who becomes Kwame Ture. You will see behind him another Howard University SNCC person, and that's Cleve Sellers. And Cleve is now president of Voorhees College, but was also one of those involved in the Orangeburg Massacre. So you will see all of these people, okay? But when you look at Gloria, now, that's who I met. That was the first leader of that kind that I had ever seen. A black woman, always looking that way, ramrod straight. Gloria is almost 90 now, and I'm still scared of her, okay? So, because Gloria, when Donna brings her in, for a while, Gloria, because they were an established black family, and Gloria, for a while decides, well, you know, I can be okay on the line, on the picket line. But she is never philosophically nonviolent. She is barely tactically nonviolent. So what happens is that at some point, she says she looks at, and her piece is in here, she looks out and she sees among this white mob that's shouting and screaming at them. She said, you know, Cambridge was small. I knew all these white people. And so I got mad. So I started tripping them. And she said her daughter, Donna, says, Ma, get off the line. If you can't be nonviolent, you need to get off the line, right? That's Gloria. So she's the first one I meet when I come into Cambridge, Maryland. And then I get through Cambridge to the national office of SNCC. See, now I'm getting to it. Okay.
Took you long enough.
Yeah, I did, I know. But you got to know who Gloria is. See?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I get to the office. I think I'm going back to Cambridge. I saw the national office of SNCC for the first time in November 1963. It was a teeny, rundown office at 8.5 Raymond Street, a one-block side street off Hunter, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard. The office was located on the second floor above a beauty shop, and it definitely did not fit my image of a national office. Because I'm assuming, you know, at least like Urban League, you know, maybe rugs on the floor or something. I was 19 and had gone to Atlanta with Reggie Robinson, SNCC's field secretary in Cambridge. From the downstairs glass door of the national office, I saw this large man at the top of the stairs, dressed in overalls and sweeping the stairs. Reggie saw him too, then ran up the stairs, and with broad smiles and much hollering, they hugged each other like long-lost brothers, and I thought, whoa, this is truly an egalitarian office, since I assumed the man to be the janitor. It was only after Reggie called the man's name that I realized this was Jim Foreman, SNCC's larger-than-life executive secretary. There was such joy, warmth, and affection in this moment that I thought, Judy, you haven't just joined an organization, you've joined a family. SNCC really is a band of brothers and a circle of trust, and I assumed I'd be in it the rest of my life. I'm just going to go one more graph.
Take your time.
Okay. Now, I later found out that Foreman often swept up, and not so much to clean the perpetually office, which was good since he wasn't all that good at it. Rather, he was showing us that, as he often said, no job was too lowly for anyone in SNCC to do, and every job was important to sustaining the organization. So Reggie introduced us, And through questioning, Foreman found out that I had taken a semester off from Swarthmore College, that I could take shorthand for those of us, for any below the age of, 40. Shorthand was kind of like texting, but with symbols. And that I could type 90 words a minute. And so I never made it back to Cambridge. And that's how I get in.
Okay. Could you, I think all of us, when you say Swarthmore College, her undergraduate institution, what does it connote? Quakers, liberalism, progressivism, social engagement. You're there as a freshman. You're going back and forth from Swarthmore to demonstrations in Maryland. At that point on that campus, what's the reaction to you?
Very split, and it surprised me. I mean, first of all, we come in as the big black class for Swarthmore, right? There were 8 of us, and 4 boys, 4 girls, with the assumption that, that way we wouldn't have to date outside the group. All the black kids were put in dorm rooms with Quaker children, assuming they would be more welcoming. And I'm doing work study, because, so I'm in the dining hall. Now, when we start going down, there are, and I won't take time to talk about it, but there were articles in the Swarthmore student paper talking about how, this was really not necessary. And in fact, I overheard somebody whom I really respected, because, he had been to Switzerland. He was a student who had been to, I had been to Buffalo, New York. And so this was like a big thing for me, that he was kind of worldly. And I overhear him saying the other thing was, he was in my Russian class, and he knew how to say, not Trotsky, what was the other one? Yanin. He didn't say Lenin like I said it, right? He said Yanin. So So what was amazing, though, is I overhear him saying that the black people should not be moving this so quickly. That it was the right of a store owner not to admit whomever he didn't want to admit. And that was on this good Quaker campus. And it's kind of like what they do with slavery, right? Oh, there was, it was only abolitionists up in the north, right? No slave owners. Well, they do that with thought about how the movement was, right? So on campus, on Swarthmore's campus, people were absolutely, the students were absolutely livid that we were tearing this campus apart, because it really was. We were having discussions in the dining room. There were people, my big sister, who had been the person assigned to help me get through my freshman year and, kind of manipulate my way around, had been wonderful until I start going down to Swarthmore. At which point to Cambridge, Maryland. And at that point, she did what some others did. They stopped speaking to us, because they really thought, I overheard one student say, those black students, they should be welcoming the chance they have to get an education at Swarthmore, and that's where their focus should be, because they can better help their people if they stay on campus.
Their people.
Their people.
One of the reasons I wanted you to say something about that is that, looking back, we overestimate the degree of consensus there existed about the movement in the North, let alone the South, right? I think one of the other things that's most disremembered, to use the old slave phrase, right? One of the other parts of the movement's history that is remembered wrong is Montgomery and the bus boycott, which is usually presented as the, quote, beginning of the movement. Problems without language, I'll leave it alone. But would you say something about how you think of the Montgomery bus boycott?
Yeah, and how I think about it was first changed by being that first staff person for what becomes Eyes on the Prize. When we think we're just doing Henry Hampton and Blackside, I'm the first staff person, have no film experience, but I'm sitting there and I'm doing research for 6 months before any production staff comes on. And so I'm looking at everything, and the only thing I see that represents what I knew in the movement was actually Simple Justice by Kluger, because he does ground up history. So you get a sense of these amazing families and children who put their lives and their livelihoods on the line to try and integrate Simple Justice is about the 5 Supreme Court cases that become Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. But what he does in a beautiful storytelling, he uses the same kind of, because Charles storytells also. And so he uses that storytelling model, and you get a real sense of the price that is paid by these people in the early 1950s as they put their children forward to try and get a better education. a more equitable education. So I'm reading that, but everything I see is only about then Reverend King. Well, no, by that time he's Dr. King. Dr. King, only about him, and even where you follow him where he goes, say to Birmingham, you don't get anything about Reverend Shuttlesworth, Fred Shuttlesworth, who is plowing that ground in Birmingham before any organization gets in, national. You don't get any of the local movement leaders who are plowing that ground before people get to them from the national offices. All you get is Dr. King. And so what it does, so when I'm reading this, I get, Stride Toward Freedom. And I finally find the name of a woman, Joanne Robinson. And Joanne Robinson was the co-chair of the Women's Political Council. Now, Joanne Robinson and her co-chair, Mrs. Mary Fair Burks, were the co-chairs at that point. So when Mrs. Parks gets arrested, and I'm finding this out through reading that there is a Joanne Robinson, but I don't find the story out until I find her, and she tells me what happens. Because I realize, oh God, a woman, this is amazing, right? And so let me try and find her. I contact somebody who gets me and says to me, I think she's now a teacher in Los Angeles. So I go through this phone book, okay. She answers the phone, and what's amazing is that nobody had contacted her up until then. She has subsequently done her own book, and she's now passed away, but at that point, she was so excited that somebody was interested in her story. So I'm asking her, it turns out that Mrs. Parks gets arrested on a Thursday night in December 5th, I think it's 5th. 5th? Okay, December 5th. Fred Gray, who was the black attorney in Montgomery, he was out seeing somebody out of town. But Clifford Durr, the white attorney, who had been friendly to the movement, along with his wife, Virginia Durr, two white liberals in Montgomery. And so it's Clifford Durr, the white attorney, who gets Mrs. Parks out of jail. But Fred Gray is told about it. He calls Joanne Robinson, co-chair of the Women's Political Council. She then calls her co-chair, Mrs. Mary Fair Burks. Mrs. Burks says, we've got the plan, let's put it into action. Because the Women's Political Council had been working to try and get a more humane form of segregation on the buses, right? You can see their letters going forward to the mayor and the city council and stuff from the early 1950s, before Mrs. Parks sits down in 1955, right? So Mrs. Joanne Robinson goes to her college, the black college, Montgomery State, pumps off, I'm talking mimeograph for those of us old enough to remember, pumps off 35,000 copies, has in place a student who goes with her, and first thing in the morning, there is a black student, and she tells me this over the phone. There's a black student standing at the curb because the Women's Political Council includes black beauticians in the black community, school teachers, principals, women who are prominent in whatever way they can be prominent within the black community. So the principals and the teachers have appointed a black student to stand at the curb. Joanne Robinson tells me over the phone, X amount of leaflets are passed to this black student. She said, without a word being said, the black student goes into the black school and distributes the leaflets, as had been set up by the Women's Political Council. Okay, so Mrs. Parks gets arrested on Thursday night. Friday night, the leaflets go out. The ministers decide to meet on Saturday, and E.D. Nixon, who again had also been plowing the ground. There were this was a very organized black community. Now, it wasn't always a harmonious black community. I mean, there were a lot of jockeyings for power and stuff. And in some ways, Dr. King gets to be the leader because, as E.D. Nixon says, Dr. King, Reverend King, had not been in town long enough for the city fathers to put their hands on him. He hadn't been corrupted yet. He's 26 years old. He's just gotten to town. He doesn't think he's going to be part of this movement. He doesn't know there's going to be a movement. But there are all these other people around him who've been organizing for years in Montgomery, and they helped to train him. So Mrs. Parks said, so Mrs. Robinson says, okay, the ministers meet, and I later find out that there was a lot of back and forth. And finally, E.D. Nixon says to the ministers, who were hemming and hawing, well, I don't know whether we want to do a boycott of the buses. And E.D. Nixon, who works under Mr. A. Philip Randolph, and I won't go through all that, too many connections. Okay, but just to know, amazing from, you know, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, is the main person behind the 1963 March on Washington, all that. Okay, that's who E.D. Nixon is trained by. E.D. Nixon looks at the ministers and says, you all need to stop hiding behind the skirts of these women. Y'all need to be men. That's when Dr. King comes out and says, okay, I will do this. There are all these things going around, and so what I hear from Joanne Robinson is the first time I realized, oh, you mean it wasn't only Dr. King? And that's where I find out about it. Yeah. Oh, could I just say, by the way, they have the meeting, they preach on Sunday about a one-day boycott of the buses. Monday comes, and everybody's wondering, are they going to stay off the buses? And nobody's on the buses. Surprises the hell out of everybody. Can I say? Really surprises everybody.
The arrest is on a Thursday. By Monday, a community of 40,000 people have a bus boycott that's 95% effective. That was the estimate that day. That can't happen over a weekend. I mean, that can only happen because there's a decade of prior organization, which sort of gets wiped out of the historical memory. We're going to have to make an editorial decision. Oh. We're down to about 5 minutes.
Oh, I'm talking too much. I'm sorry. Oh, God.
You know, it's wonderful. I think we should let the questions go.
Okay. I got you. Okay.
We're going to talk right through the question period. I want to ask a question about two of your co-authors and two Chicagoans. This will take us back to what you said about the difference between tactical nonviolence and philosophical nonviolence. So we will start with Mildred Foreman Page, right? Young woman has grown up in Chicago, goes to Atlanta. It is 1962. She goes to her first demonstration. When the cops come to arrest everybody, she does her level best to surrender to the cops, right? There was one young rookie cop, if my memory is correct, who, we won't even speculate on his motives.
White, we should say white.
White, it's Atlanta.
Well, no, but they don't know.
See, all right, sorry. Young white rookie cop who really wanted to arrest her, even though she is trying to surrender. So he wants to push her down to the concrete and drag her over to the paddy wagon. She's telling the man, I am trying to surrender, right? He doesn't get the message. As she tells it, she simply forgot herself, and before she understood what she was doing, she slugged the man. Once you slug one cop, you've got to slug the other cops who come to help that cop, right? Well, she made the evening news. That the next morning, Dr. King jokes with her that perhaps henceforth she should stay in the office during demonstrations because she was ruining the whole idea of nonviolence, right? That's Mildred Foreman Page. Her colleague, and these stories are only a few months apart, right? That's Georgia, this one is Mississippi. That spring of '62, Diane Nash, the other Chicagoan, was sentenced for protest activities for 2.5 years in the Mississippi state prison system. At the time of her sentence, she was 6 months pregnant, and she said very famously, you know, Jet was all over this line, this will be a Negro child born in Mississippi. So wherever he is born, he will be born in jail. Right? The state, for whatever reasons, actually backed off the sentence. Diane endured all kinds of brutalities and horrors in the jail system of Mississippi, but they never went through with that threat to put her away for 2.5 years. And Diane would attribute that to the power of nonviolence, right? They were the ones who got scared. I think that was her quote, or very near that. No matter what she went through, Diane Nash, her commitment to nonviolence was just absolutely, utterly unshakable. It never wavered, right? Could you talk about those two different ways to think about, or talk about the role of nonviolence and how complex it was?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I divide it between tactical nonviolence and philosophical nonviolence. And it's really important to understand that Diane's coming out of the Nashville movement. So I once said to Julian, I said, oh, you know, Julian, were you philosophically nonviolent? He said, no, that was the Nashville movement. Okay. Now, the point was, in terms of philosophical nonviolence, the point was not to somehow escalate the violence. And it was felt by particularly Reverend
James Lawson.
James Lawson. that one of the things that would happen is that, I mean, it went a little farther than this, but it was that if you respond with resistance, that then you will get another resistance and it will keep escalating and it will never stop. Now, for many of us in SNCC who are there after Diane leaves and after the Nashville movement has a center, they have basically left. Diane leaves, John is still there, John Lewis is still there, but Bernard Lafayette has left. So you've gotten, by the time I get there in '63, much of the force and the of the Nashville movement has really kind of been lessened in many ways. So what I come into is tactical nonviolence, which is what most of the local people we worked with, and you put it in beautifully in your book.
I've got the light.
I've got the light of freedom. I mean, what you find, I mean, there are folks, there's Emily Crosby, Dr. Emily Crosby has done a wonderful piece called "This Nonviolence Ain't No Good, It'll Get You Killed." Now, it is a direct quote from Hartman Turnbow, who was a farmer, and it's important to know he was a black farmer in the Delta of Mississippi.
Landowner.
I'm sorry, he was a landowner. That's the most important point. And so he said, you know, I will come at a man. If he comes at me in a civilized way, I will come back at him in a civilized way. But if he comes in a non-civilized way, I will come back at him in that way too. And he has a wonderful interview in Howard Raines's, the Howard Raines New York Times executive editor, My Soul is Rested. And in that interview, one of the first oral histories of the movement, Hartman Turnbow, black landowner, says, you know, in '62, white vigilantes came on my land and shot all in it. In '63, they came back and I shot back. And he said, I got a call from the FBI. And I said to them, and they said, don't shoot nobody, don't shoot nobody. And I said, look, you all come straddling my fence, and you all said, don't shoot nobody, and my wife and daughter were almost killed in '62, last year. He said, if you want this to stop, he said, you got to do something. And unless you do, I'm going to get my 12 gauge and see who can I shoot. And he said, and there ain't been no trouble since. Now, that's what we were protected in many ways, as Emily Crosby has also mentioned. One of the reasons that more of us did not get killed was because local people, they were Southerners. They had guns. They hunted with guns. And they did not do initiated violence, but very much so. They were about, and they would not do anything that endangered their community, their families, and families was widespread. They would do nothing that endangered the community or would call down wholesale violence on their community. But if it was about an individual vigilante coming up, Stokely used to talk about this. He said, if I get anywhere near Hartman Turnbow's house, I'm safe. Because sheriffs know that Hartman Turnbow will fire back at them. And that happens even with Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, those three particular civil rights workers who come up missing in 1964, when SNCC and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality people, go to try and find them, because the FBI isn't doing diddly squat. When they go on the lands of the plantations, you will hear from Cleve Seller's book that there are black sharecroppers who are on the roofs of the houses where the SNCC and CORE people are staying, guarding those houses with guns. And so part of it is that, yeah.
I wanted you to keep going.
Oh, you did? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
okay.
I needed to do a time check.
Okay, gotcha.
No, we can do something. Part of the post-'60s narrative about the '60s is that the people who were activists then, well, are conservatives now, that they're selling insurance and they're hedge fund managers. I mean, that's the extreme, but I think you know what I'm saying. Would you say something about what your colleagues are doing now, how you see that discourse? I'll be right back.
Okay. What's wonderful about the skills and the values that we got in SNCC is that many of us carried it through the rest of our lives. So when I'm doing Eyes on the Prize, that to me is movement work. When people are in education, a lot of folks went into education, that is part of movement work. When you see Bernice Regan, for example, She was a SNCC freedom singer. She is a leader in her own right coming out of the Albany, Georgia movement. And when she gets tapped by SNCC to become a SNCC person, she then becomes a SNCC freedom singer, but then she found Sweet Honey in the Rock, right? And is, by the way, a MacArthur Genius Grant awardee. You get somebody like Bob Moses, who comes down from New York. He then is now has been for years, working in urban education and working to try and get algebra in at a younger age, because his idea is that algebra is the gateway to the sciences, to the STEM courses. And so what he says is we have to do this as part of an organizing tool and helping parents to organize to get these courses into their schools. So you've got the Algebra Project in hundreds of schools all over the country. That's Bob. He was our Mississippi project director, another MacArthur Genius Grant awardee. You've got all of these people who, Maria Varela, comes off of, was in Selma, was in Mississippi, goes up after she leaves Mississippi to the hills of Tierra Maria in New Mexico to work with local people, again, really important, local people around sheep herders cooperatives and clinic, a local women's clinic up in the hills of Tierra Maria in New Mexico. And she's another MacArthur Genius Grant awardee. But none of these people are in any way rich. But what they brought with them is the values that they're carrying through to the rest of their lives. And so it's not just John Lewis and the Congress, it's not just Julian Bond, NAACP chair, it's all of the other folks who brought, in lots of small ways and big ways. Dottie Zellner, one of our co-editors for Hands on the Freedom Plow, goes into the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is a advocacy group of lawyers, what would you say about the center, who take, for example, they would take Guantanamo cases of the prisoners in Guantanamo. They take First Amendment rights. They do a lot of work around legal issues. Well, Dottie's working there for years at no money, because there was a sense that you respected what people before you had done. They didn't know that they would ever see the change that they were working for. But the assumption was, if you do nothing, nothing changes. If you do nothing, nothing changes. You may never see it, but you can't just sit there and watch it happen. So all of our folks, I think, moved in lots of different directions, but with the same sense of skills and values that we got in SNCC.
You know, Bob Moses, whom you mentioned, used to visit my classes when I was teaching civil rights courses on the East Coast, and he'd say, students would ask, well, what do you do now? He says, well, I'm trying to teach mathematics to inner city children, and my students would say, oh, you've left the movement, eh? And from Bob's viewpoint, of course, that's almost blasphemy, right? But it shows how profoundly they misunderstood the movement from the viewpoint of that group of people. Yes. One. Two, the other thing that really bothers me about that whole discourse, well, they've gotten rich now, is that you have a situation in which one group of people have taken a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, out of their lives to work for social justice. And then another group of people who, by and large, haven't done anything to make the world better, say that those folks are invalid because they aren't still doing what they were doing when they were 22, right? It is just such an inversion of the way in which we should be thinking about, if they get rich, fine. I wish they would. So do
I.
All right, we probably have 2 more questions left. Okay. All right, we're going to try to do 2 questions in 5 minutes. All right. I think I'm skipping a question about what she thinks about the Occupy movement and connecting that to SNCC. I just want you to know, I want you to know what you're missing. Right? I'm actually going to quote Bob Moses, your colleague, 1965. If my memory is right, he's speaking at Berkeley when he says this. I want to tell you about Mrs. Hazel Palmer, who is a woman who works in the Freedom Democratic Party in Mississippi. She was working for $10, $15 a week as a maid most of her life. She stopped and changed last summer. And if you want to write her, and I suggest you do, a lot of you, drop her a line, ask her, what did you used to do? What do you do now? How come you changed? What gave you the courage to do that? What makes you think that instead of being a cook in somebody's kitchen, you could help run a political party? Where did you learn how to do that? Did you go to school? Would you say something about that last, about SNCC as a school, about SNCC as a learning experience, a transformative experience?
Yeah. I mean, I guess what's amazing to me is nobody ever stopped you from doing things. You know, I mean, when I came up with this idea about doing a residential freedom school that was going to bring Southern kids with a lot of energy and hope and sense that they could do something to change things, together with some of the Chicago guys who were on the South Side and in the gangs, there was a sense of, okay, you're going to have this synergy. And I won't go into what happens when we do this residential freedom school. What I will say is that when I proposed this, nobody said to me, Judy, you have never done anything like this in your life. Why do you think you can do this? No one ever said this. It's like Jean Smith says in the book when she realizes that she is an organizer. And she said, I always felt in SNCC that I could be, how did she say? I could be, basically there was nothing to stop me but me. That's how she frames it. And so when you were in discussions, and we would have long discussions, you all know this, we would have long discussions that would go 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And by the way, a wonderful representation of this is in a film called, it's a dramatic film, but it is so based on fact and so righteous. It's called Freedom Song. Has Danny Glover in the best role I have ever seen him in. You can get it on Amazon for like $8.50 a DVD. I show it at all my teacher workshops. And what it shows is what happens when SNCC goes into Macomb, Mississippi in 1961. It's called Freedom Song, and it's every black actor you've ever seen. Loretta Devine, Glenn Turman, they're all there, okay? But what's wonderful is that you get all of the little pieces, and one of the pieces you get is the SNCC meeting. But what was wonderful about SNCC meetings is it's not only that you're hashing over things, you're trying to get consensus, because given the fact that some of the things that are being proposed really are endangering your lives. And so you want to make sure that you have really thought it out, given also that you are working with people, adults in the community, who are putting their lives and livelihoods on the line. You want to make sure that you have really thought through the question of what's going to happen 6 weeks from now, what's going to happen 6 months from now. And we are 18, 19, 20 years old, thinking that far in advance. So we're going over all of this. What is it going to mean if we do this? So we do all of that, but the other part is, oh my goodness, have I lost my point? I don't know. See, sometimes I used to be able to go far afield, and I would come back to the main road. What I find recently is I don't always come back to the main road. So, but something about, oh, I know, okay. So the main part was that you never felt that people were personally attacking you. Now, they might attack your position, but there were no ad hominem attacks. There was nothing, and that was even within the context that we are young people. And so you might be sitting in a room with somebody who's dating your boyfriend, and you know it, and you are not that happy about it. But the bottom line is, given that you've got the whole apparatus of the state amassed against you, from the feds all the way down to the locals, and what you're trying to do is, at its bottom, getting black people registered to vote without getting them killed, and getting some economic power, and getting some power on a lot of different issues. If that's your main goal, what you don't want to do is endanger that in any major way. And so you've got to also make sure that somebody's got your back. And you may be arguing with them on other issues, but it never becomes, in a staff meeting, it doesn't become personal. It becomes political. And those were some heavy arguments, and I never spoke up in staff meetings. Because people, I mean, Stokely's talking about Kant and Hegel, and so-and-so's talking about, you know, what's organizing in Mississippi. All of these people are bringing things that I had no idea of. I'm coming from Tarrytown. Who knew Tarrytown, you know? So for me, it was, I better shut up and listen. And that's one of the skills I bring into filmmaking. You need to shut up and listen. Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. Who's in charge? I know
who's in charge? We used to say that, yes.
Can we get 2 more minutes? No, hey. At these events, there's a tension in me about whether we're remembering Dr. King or disremembering Dr. King. I mean, the Dr. King who gets created at these events is such a small part of the reality as I understand it. Would you say something about that? What has happened to what's been done to his memory?
Yeah. I mean, I think in some ways we've neutered him. I mean, that's the best I can do. He was amazing, particularly when he comes up to Chicago, tries to take the nonviolent movement north, but then he starts realizing, no, I think he always did. He really becomes vocal about the endemic, the systemic nature of racism. So he's not just talking about a bull corner. He's not talking about the exception of, this is what's happening in this location. He's talking about the endemic nature of American racism. And that's what blows people away. But that's what you don't hear so much about. So one of the things, and you see him in footage in Eyes on the Prize, when he starts going into the issue of economic justice, and you see him in a speech that last year, and he says in a church, in a black church in the South, he says, it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. That's Dr. King in 1967, 68, a radical redistribution of economic power. Now, I clipped the New York Times, and this particular day, they had a quote of the day. It's on the inside front of the Times, and it was from Reverend Joe Lowry, who takes over Dr. King's organization, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, after Reverend Abernathy has passed, and so Joe Lowry, at that point, is the head of it. And he's talking about what we've done to Dr. King's image. And he says, we've put Martin King on this rotunda of irrelevant adulation and removed him from the struggle for economic justice. Somewhere along the line, says Reverend Lowry, we managed to resurrect the messenger and bury the message. And you get that in terms of, I remember using, and this is going to be real quick, I remember using Dr. King's Riverside speech, which is really amazing, and using it when I spoke at the National Security Administration, the people who are illegally wiretapping us, at their annual King Day celebration in wherever it is in Maryland, right? And I had to be very careful, and I said to the woman who invited me, I said, you know what I talk about, right? Because I was talking a lot against the war, but I was always using paper, newspaper clips, so people wouldn't think, and I learned this from SNCC, you document everything. So it's not Judy Richardson saying this, it's 5-star Marine Corps Major Anthony Zinni in a Washington Post article, okay, at a Veterans Day memorial service, or somebody in the Wall Street Journal talking about this is a war of choice, and this is what's going to happen. So I'm quoting these things, right? But I had to be very careful because this is the NSA, right? And so I go in, and I realize when I say to the woman who asked me, she said, I said, now I also, she said, well, we want you to talk about Dr. King. I said, yes. And I said, now I also talk against the war. And this is a black woman. She said, oh, you're getting sticky now. And so she said, well, if you can frame it around Dr. King's quotes, that's when I really went back to the Riverside speech. And it was like amazing, absolutely amazing. So I used that. I'm thinking people are going to walk out of the breakfast, right? They don't. The chaplain claps, everybody claps. I come off, and first of all, I was really worried, so I'd been worried about it for a month. I come off the podium, and there is a line of folks from the National Security Administration. The first person is a white woman who says very low, and everybody, by the way, who is in this line talks very low to me. And she says, I'm so glad you said this. She said, we're afraid to say this. And I hugged her because, first of all, I was relieved I was over this speech that I had been dreading going forward on. And then I get to another older black woman, actually probably younger than I am now, but in any event, she was a middle-aged black woman. And she said, I have worked here for years, and I used to want, she said, my daughter to work here, but no more. And then I got to a younger black woman who said, oh, this is wonderful. She said, I'm so glad you did this. Now, I'm speaking louder than she did, because everybody really is whispering to me when they say how they enjoy the speech. And this young woman says, I really enjoyed what she said. She said, now, of course, they're not going to invite you back. So, but part of the reason I end up doing it with all of the things I had been afraid to do was because of SNCC. It was like, you got to speak truth to power. And even though I was afraid they're going to walk out on me, it was like, no, you got to do this, you know. But that was the SNCC stuff.
Well, that's a perfect ending. Maybe the most important thing to understand about the movement is its capacity to make people do things they were afraid to do, didn't think they understood how to do. People grew out of themselves, right? And so now you can say two things. You can tell people you've been to a SNCC meeting, and like every other SNCC meeting, it's ending late, right?
That's right.
But I hope you get some sense of the energy, the optimism, the inclusive spirit, the charisma that she projects, right? Because that really is much of the spirit of the movement. And so let us thank her.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Let's go over there. Oh, okay, fine.
I got it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Charles, can we do it afterwards? Can we do it after?
After.
Yeah.
We don't want to stop the program.
Yeah.
Would you please be seated for a moment? I'm Elizabeth Davenport, Dean of Rockefeller Chapel. Now may this celebration and commemoration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. inspire you anew to do what is right and good, to work on, to struggle on for justice and freedom, never to forget, to be beacons of hope till earth and heaven do ring with those harmonies of liberty. Hear Dr. King's footsteps sounding still in this place. Hear his voice amidst these stones and in your hearts. Stand for Dr. King and for his legacy. Go in peace. Go in hope.